Good afternoon. Thank you, Hollywood Monster, for giving us the opportunity. I didn't realise how courageous a company they were putting an economist on first, so if anybody falls asleep, can you just nudge them? Just to go through, what I thought I'd do first of all was give you a description of the Midlands and the West Midlands economy to know where we're moving from. If you look at the Midlands economy, we tend to see the Midlands economy as the East and the West together. Basically, the division between the East and the West Midlands was a temporary measure by Alfred the Great to deal with some Danish tourists, and we haven't really resolved that issue now. But if you look at the size of the Midlands economy, it's probably on par with about Austria or Bavaria, and so the type of city that Birmingham should be aspiring to replicate is probably Vienna or Munich. So that's one of the key things we're looking at. It's a very sizable economy. One of the other features of the Midlands economy is if you go to like Sweden, they probably have 3 or 4 global brands depending on what the tax regime is. If you go to the Netherlands, then they have 2 or 3. But in the Midlands we have about 40 different global brands. And apologies to Hollywood Monster. Monster I wasn't able to put their logo on straight away. But it's a really successful and dynamic economy, and actually one of the main catalysts within the global economy. And if you just consider West Bromwich Albion, when they do score a goal, then there's something like 500 million people around the world watch them. So we have some really good access to international branding. The other thing about the economy is the strength of the economy. This is using the purchasing managers indices that come out once a month. But basically, the red line is the West Midlands performance, and the blue line is the East Midlands performance. And basically for the last 4 or 5 years, the West Midlands economy has been outperforming the national economy. And given the strength of manufacturing in the region, then we anticipate that the growth will be at least 0.5% or 1% stronger than that achieved nationally. And I think that'll have a fairly big impact. We put this growth chart together about 2 or 3 weeks ago when everybody was predicting that after Brexit we'll go to hell in a handcart. But if you look at, there was a sudden dip in confidence just around in July, but since then the latest figures have actually shown that growth is going to be much stronger than we anticipated. So I think this chart's actually wrong now, and we should be actually looking at slightly firmer growth than what we anticipated. The big problem at the minute, if you're an importer, is obviously sterling. If on the other hand you're a manufacturer that exports, it's actually quite a good proposition. But overall we think that sterling will probably devalue by about 25% from its previous peak. Last week it went down to 113 against the dollar, but that was a temporary malfunction. But I think the bottom range is probably about 110 against the dollar by the end of the year. Although the minute an economist makes a forecast on a currency, it's probably going the other way. But until the government actually clarifies what its Brexit position is, then I think the markets are going to be fairly unsteady about what's going to happen. Again, the big problem for the UK economy is the red line, which is the current account deficit. And at 6% of GDP, which was the last reported figures, that's normally when the IMF step in to bail the current country out. The thing is that because of the scale of foreign direct investment and the performance of, say, the banks, then we've been able to offset our current account deficit. The banks actually, since the crisis, haven't really performed that well, and Brexit has thrown up a number of questions about whether foreign direct investment will sustain. But I think the depreciation of sterling will actually lead to a sourcing of locally produced goods and hopefully a correction in the current account deficit. Again, this is just one on the West Midlands data. The most notable feature about the statistics on the English regions are that they're really rubbish. They're not very accurate at all, and most developing countries have better statistics than we have in the English regions to try and predict what's going on. But if you look, this is the only data we've got available, but we have running a fairly significant merchandise trade deficit. Again, one of the things we're trying to do is try and understand the economy. If you listen to the newspapers or the journalists, then they'll tell you that the economy is about 15% is manufacturing and 85% is services. Well, as a policy maker, that doesn't really tell you much at all. So what we've tried to do is try and understand the structure of the economy. And we've looked at manufacturing, which in the West Midlands is about 15% of the economy, and then looked at the service sector industries that are actually wholly or partially dependent on the manufacturing sector. And then we've come up with a figure of about 31% of the local economy. And again, in terms of the overall services sector, I think there's a big distinction between banking, solicitors and accountancy and the actual distribution network in terms of logistics and supply. Then again, in distribution, the West Midlands has some leading industries and some leading indicators. In the service sector, we're perhaps a little bit weaker. But the key thing that we see is this horrible phrase, which is this one here, which we've called manu services, and that's where we think all of the growth will take place. And that's the industries, or the service sector industries, that are actually working with the manufacturing sector and introducing this servitization. So it's engineers, it's architects, it's IT suppliers, and it's augmented reality people. And that's where we see a really big growth area. Again, I just put some quick figures together in terms of the size, the comparative size of the wholesale and retail sector. In the West Midlands, the wholesale and retail sector is about 10% of overall output across the economy. And again, one of the things, these slides are all available to you later on, but I will try and get to them as quickly as possible. One of the things that the councils tend to do is report comparative gross value added, which is the amount of output we do, by everybody that lives in the region, and that's why we get figures that Birmingham is about £20,000 per head, but really we should be actually looking at the number of workers. And if you do it by the number of workers, then Birmingham comes out at around about £48,000 gross value added created per worker, which makes for a much more interesting proposition than if you're saying it's 20,000. Then that's the average figure. Quite a lot of our advanced manufacturing and service sector industries are generating gross value added per capita in the region of £90,000 to £100,000. And that's why we are one of the more successful, advanced and dynamic economies. Again, if you look at gross disposable household income, then there is a significant catchment area of wealth. The big problem on all of the data is that you include London, particularly if you include inner London, then that distorts all of the figures. Whereas if you actually, what we try and do is take inner London out, which is basically the financial centre, and then the West Midlands is actually performing much closer to the average. Again, if we look at productivity, it is a bit irritating that we get a number of people saying that there isn't any manufacturing sector in the UK or in the West Midlands anymore, and usually they've driven in a Jaguar Land Rover or a Toyota to the meeting, and we'll ask them how we got there and where it was produced. But there's been a tremendous hemorrhage in the labour force within the manufacturing sector, but productivity has actually remained the same or actually gone up. So productivity levels have actually increased quite enormously. And that's the same in the transport and logistics sector, and also in the retail sector. And if you look at the period between 1997 and 2007, the financial services sector probably increased its productivity by about 32% over that period per worker, but in the manufacturing sector it was about 40%, and in transport and logistics it was about 52%. So actually what you've got here is actually a really dynamic economy. Again, we just put some figures together in terms of comparative regional wholesale and retail GVA. And the West Midlands is actually quite strong in terms of per capita expenditure on wholesale and retail. So, anticipated this slide, but you can see how the collapse in manufacturing in terms of the labour force has gone from 22% this half to about 11%. That's partly because of the closure of a number of factories and the change in manufacturing, but it's also largely to do with outsourcing. But in the wholesale and retail sector, then actually manufacturing has remained relatively consistent. I'll now get to do a quick run through on Brexit. I think if we'd have stayed inside the European Union, we would have been confronted with exactly the same problems that we're confronted now. It's not necessarily the trading relationships that's the problem. It's the skills question, it's the infrastructure question. And I must admit, I did vote to stay in, but since then we've never had been inundated by so much work with everybody terrified about what's going on. So there is a silver lining. But basically, instead of the 350 million that everybody was talking about that we're paying to the EU, it only works out at about 1.1% of total fiscal expenditure. And if anybody's ever used Office of National Statistics, if they're accurate within 1% of GDP, then they're doing really well. So it's actually a fairly meaningless sum. I think that the big question is how we maintain the trading relationship. Again, the West Midlands has been one of the most dynamic exporting regions in the country, and it also has a big presence in terms of the export market to the European Union. We like to say that 15% of all German car components are sourced from the West Midlands. We don't actually know what the figure is, we just made it up and are hoping that the Germans will correct it and say it's 14.9%. But the main thing is, despite the fact that we have some major exporting companies, the electorate was decisively leaving. There's a whole host of reasons why it could be attributed why they want to leave, but there's definitely a disconnect between the population of the West Midlands and the actual political and business elite, which obviously needs to be addressed. If we go through the immediate impact, one of the most unusual things was that in terms of British politics was that a decision was made, which is completely unusual for our government. The other thing was that Parliament actually abdicated responsibility, and we had a plebiscite or a referendum. They couldn't make their mind up, so they decided to confront the British electorate. The British electorate have then given them a decision, and now the parliamentarians are saying we want to change that. That doesn't work. We've had a democratic vote, and whether you like it or not, we are going to leave the European Union. And however much you argue about the nitty-gritty, we will be leaving. And I think what is incumbent across for everybody in this room is to actually make that a success. We can't argue whether it's bad or good now. We've got to say how do we make the ingredients to actually succeed in this, and it could be a powerful shock. We have a new government, which actually looks like it's got a new policy orientation. They're very slow at actually making decisions by the looks of it, and they're very slow at articulating what to do. But there is a definite shift into a more, not necessarily interventionist state, but a more activist state, where they're getting involved in meeting deficiencies within the economy. Theresa May made one speech during her election campaign, and 8 minutes later she was the Prime Minister, so obviously she didn't get time to really develop a policy. But in the one speech that she made in Birmingham, she made a big wish list. And I think there's some really interesting things in there for the English regions. It's no longer really a Midlands engine or a Northern powerhouse, it's a more comprehensive solution to economic development, regional development across the country, and also some key things about infrastructure development, and she even made some positive comments about Birmingham Airport. In terms of the other things, each one of these aspects would be a major problem for a government. So at the time that they're having to deal with Brexit, they're also having to deal with these other major political and policy issues. I haven't a clue what's happening in the Labour Party. It just seems to have imploded. At the precise moment we need an effective opposition, they've decided to have election after election after election, still not talking to each other. And so we're not getting any proper opposition forcing the government to articulate what they want. Scottish separatism, until the oil price collapsed, raised its ugly head again. And whether that goes on, we need to really understand that. The Sinn Féin decided to calm the situation down by calling for a referendum on Irish reunification the day after the election. And unfortunately, that's now the position of the Irish opposition and the Irish government. So there's definitely some fraying of tensions there. Whether we do get any political realignments will be of quite interest. Before UKIP imploded last week, I thought that they had some serious potential to make some inroads in the Midlands. and the north, but it's still not beyond the bounds of possibility. There are various options that are and are not available in terms of Brexit. One of the problems I have is we'll immediately revert to World Trade Organization status, or at least that's what the politicians tell us. Unfortunately, we joined the World Trade Organization as a member of the European Union, so whether that affects our membership would be useful if one of the ministers actually rung up the World Trade Organization and asked them whether we're still members. But we will actually probably revert to World Trade Organization status in the immediate term. The other options that are not available are the European Economic Area. This comprises of those economic powerhouses, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, and basically they've already said that they wouldn't consider the UK joining the European Economic Area because it would just be too disruptive. Similarly, the Canadian Pact, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, is neither comprehensive, focused on trade or really economic, and it's also been opposed by the Bavarian government and a few of the other German landowners because I think there's some big problems. Then there's the bespoke bilateral deal, and that's the Swiss option. Unfortunately, the European Union doesn't like the Swiss option, and that's been eroded. So I think what we've got to do is recognise currently, as members of the European Union, we have an asymmetric relationship with the European Union in terms of the fact we're not a member of the Euro, we're not participant in Schengen, and there's a number of other exclusions on labour laws and on the various judicial things. And I think we should use that as a position of strength and then move forward from what we have already to negotiate a new type of British transition. The big problem for me is that Brexit timetable that everybody's talking about just deals with a political and constitutional arrangement. So in 2019 we'll have politically and constitutionally left the European Union, and then it will be ratified by 27 member parliaments of the European Union, and then you can start trade talks. Now the average lifetime of a trade talks, if you're favourable, is about 7 years. If you look at the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that was first muted in the 1980s and 1990s, and it still hasn't been resolved. So I think what we really need to do is have an interim arrangement that hopefully preserves the current access that we have, and then they can look at a new type of trading agreement that's hopefully beneficial to the UK. But you are looking at trade talks, if you're optimistic, concluding about 2029. And then whoever's a member of the European Union, all of those parliaments will then have to ratify it. So there's some huge tasks to be done here. At the same time, we've got to continue trading. And I think that's one of the big problems for me, is that we shouldn't be well, we have to focus on, but the government's sole attention seems to be on trade agreements, but rather than trade. If you don't trade with anybody, how are you going to have a trade agreement? So we need to be actually looking between now and 2030 in terms of how we actually boost trade. The other thing that we've got to do is also revise about 45 years of legislation that has the European Union Act in it. I'm nearly finished. Then if we'll actually look at the negotiations starting, the fact that a new ministry was created and actually found some offices for the new ministry was quite positive. The terrifying thing is, well, we'll have more gold medalist cyclists than we do have trade negotiators at the moment. So we've obviously got to build up some trade negotiators. The key problem for me is, what we don't want is a bunch of economists that can tell you a regression curve on what our trading relationship is with Brazil. What you need is actually negotiators that know how to export toilet rolls to Brazil, or milk to Mongolia, or jewellery to India, then that's a key factor. For the West Midlands, the big problem is that the Cabinet is consulted with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, London, Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man. But there isn't any formal yet involvement of the West Midlands in the negotiating process. And then, so it's incumbent, given the size of our manufacturing sector, that we're involved in these negotiations. And as the government said, that the negotiations will commence probably on April the 1st, it's probably a useful date. One of the big problems you will also have is tariff barriers, and the actual tariffs themselves will be a problem but given the depreciation of sterling, there won't be that much of a problem. The key thing is the non-tariff barriers in terms of the amount of paperwork you want and things like that. The French are past masters at this, and 20 years ago when the Japanese were importing too many tellies into France and it was causing problems for the French television producers, they couldn't stop it under World Trade Organization status. So the French suddenly announced that the only port that was acceptable to import televisions into France was Douarnenez, which is a very tiny little port on Normandy. It's the equivalent of us telling the Chinese that the only place that can import steel or take steel as a port would be Tenby. And basically, that brought the Japanese to the negotiating table fairly quickly and had them negotiating. But this is an area we need to look at. We did try and have I haven't got time now, but we did try and have a look at where we can actually increase the number of the new export markets. The US, China and probably Germany are 2 or 3 areas where we can actually increase exports. But it's the rest of the world that we really need to look at. And unfortunately, these are the most distant and smallest economies. But if we're going to be successful in exporting to them, then we need some major infrastructure investments into the West Midlands in terms of Birmingham Airport, the transport distribution network, and probably HS2. And that's the areas. I tried to pick the top 20 countries that Boris Johnson hadn't insulted. It was a bit difficult. But really the areas that we're going to actually be looking at are Japan, Hong Kong, Mexico, Singapore and Taiwan. And that's where we could make some significant penetration. I think I'll just finish there, that's all right. I mean, the main problem for us is that Brexit is going to happen and we have to make it a success. But the only way that we can make it a success is if people like yourselves are actually involved in putting forward what your objections are. The depreciation of sterling is already causing some significant upsurge in import prices, and so that needs to be dealt with. But obviously the slides are available to you all at the end of the conference, and if you want to contact us and find out some more, we're quite happy to talk to you.